There are many shows dedicated to Magic the Gathering strategies, decks, and formats. But unlike all of them, this channel is about discussing an individual card, an isolated card, an unrelated card. This is an Magic card. Hello, digital chums, and welcome back to another exhaustive random card discussion with me, your host being the cupboard's most dusty. With any luck, this will be yet another banger of a winding path towards trivial Magic the Gathering knowledge and collateral infotainment. Or perhaps it will be a complete waste of time. Or perhaps it will be both of those things at the same time. Before I can waste any more of your time with that nonsense though, first I'll have to waste some more of your time scrutinizing the time you wasted by leaving comments on my last video. Servius stated that they are happy to support another small content creator, but I regret to inform you that I'm over 8 feet tall. Feel free to drag your mouse backwards through the progress bar on all of my videos to take back your views. Armadillo AI followed my example and was randomly assigned the card Frost Titan, which they suggested I talk about in one of my videos, which assuming I live long enough, I guarantee that I will eventually do. I'll start eating healthier and exercising just to increase the odds for you. Luke Soderblom informed me that the finals of the 1996 Los Angeles Pro Tour, which I referenced in my last video, lasted 5 hours, which literally made my jaw hit the floor in a figurative sense. I guess slow really is what turtles do best. Twice in a row, Madden 1510 said,
big show.
And I have absolutely no idea what this is meant to communicate, but I also love it more than anything in the world. Ristic Studies applauded my atrocious Italian pronunciation in the last video. Growing up as a child, I had a noticeably Italian grandmother, but the only words I ever gleaned from her were sit down, be quiet, and eat. Sam, who runs the channel Ristic Studies, is an Italian language expert, so this blessing gives me a lot of relief. If you were looking for more long-form Magic content, you should check out the Ristic Studies channel. They only have 174,000 subscribers, so you might not have heard of them before. With those clever, moving, and deeply insightful comments out of the way, we can prancercise on over to the primary objective of this videographic escapade. Our randomly selected card for this episode, one of the most foundational cards in the history of that mysticism which musters.
All right, we're back on the Gatherer. Got our turtle friend with its mana value of 2. It's really important to note that. And our new card is it's this thing. Also has a mana value of 2. So a Whirling Dervish. Look at it whirl. Huh. I do not know this card. It looks like it was originally printed in I guess it was printed in Legends. Okay. Huh. Honestly, looking at this card, I thought it was printed in Arabian Nights. It looks like an Arabian Nights card, but I guess it's not. And we'll probably learn about that and about also a bunch of other stuff, probably.
Whirling Dervish is a 2-mana uncommon 1/1 green human monk creature from Legends. Although originally its creature type was Dervish, which I'm sure I'll end up discussing at great length, to both explain what a Dervish even is, and then to assess its eventual recategorization. When I first saw this card, I immediately thought that it was from Arabian Nights, which we discussed in the previous video. But after looking into this card even a tiny amount, I've learned that it is not from Arabian Nights. Mostly, if not entirely, because it was not printed in Arabian Nights. But part of me deep down still feels like it might be from Arabian Nights. The set Legends actually had quite a few cards which would seem right at home in that Scimitar Emblazoned set, like Alabar's Carpet, Kismet, and my boy Hazezon Tamar, for whom Wizards of the Coast has intentionally neglected to print an appropriate Sand Warrior creature token for 26 years, specifically to spite me personally. Deep down in my bloody guts, I have a sneaking feeling that we've discussed a card from Legends before, but this notion is also untrue, and is likely just the result of us touching upon cards from this hallowed set in numerous other videos, as we crisscross our way across the rectangle-laden history of this collectible card game of Sorcerous Assembly. The set Legends was unleashed upon the world on Wednesday, the 1st of June in the year of 1994 AD, or BCE if we want to keep things secular. This release most closely correlates with me beginning to play Magic the Gathering, as while I had glimpsed Magic cards in the hands of my very cool older cousins, I had not purchased any myself until at least the summer of 1994. The previous summer, sitting on the carpet in my noticeably Italian grandmother's ranch, my older cousin had informed me that Blue Elemental Blast was the most powerful card in the entire game. And for some reason, despite being a complete moron, I knew that this statement was facetious. This was potentially the only smart conclusion I ever reached in the first 10 years of my existence. You might think that I'm being hard on myself by saying this, but keep in mind that at 10 years of age, I chose to have a bowl cut and chose to collect medieval Legos instead of the much cooler Ice Planet Legos. Later, I would go over to a friend's house and see his full Ice Planet Lego playset, replete with space buggies and transparent orange chainsaws, and come face to face with the reality of my own idiocy. On Wednesday, June 1st, 1994, I had not yet come to terms with such terrible personal failure. I was most likely distracted by the news of the Republic of South Africa rejoining the Commonwealth after holding a democratic election. If you're unsure what this means, join the club. The club is based around not understanding or even wanting to understand the intricacies of British colonial entanglement. I am the captain of the club. I spent 5 long, arduous minutes trying to figure out what exactly the ramifications and rationalizations a democratic republic would have for wanting to rejoin a commonwealth, which seems to be overseen by the British monarchy. But 5 minutes was not sufficient, so I watched a 15-minute video which contained a 2-minute NordVPN sponsorship, so consider that a bullet which I took for you. The crucial takeaway, though, is that the elections of 1994 are what ended the apartheid in South Africa and saw Nelson Mandela elected to power. The Commonwealth is an association of former British colonies who work together for common goals, which all seems well and good to me, but at the same time the Queen of England is still listed as being the head of the Commonwealth, so that membership seems like kind of a weird way to celebrate your status as a former colony. Either way, apartheid bad, Nelson Mandela good, colonialism bad, de Antwoord good. Less confusingly, June 1st, 1994 is also the 20-year anniversary of the Journal of Medicine publishing the first aid technique developed by American doctor Henry Heimlich, which is commonly known as the Henry Heimlich maneuver, or sometimes just the Heimlich maneuver. I'm pretty excited about this fact because it gives me an excellent excuse to play a clip from the movie Mrs. Doubtfire and do a spot-on impression of Robin Williams saying hello in a funny high-pitched voice. Hello! Hello! It's pretty good. According to Wikipedia, the Heimlich maneuver is also simply known as abdominal thrusts, which I'm 99% sure nobody has ever called it ever. Not even once. June 1st is also World Milk Day. Leave a comment below if you've ever drank milk before in your entire life. Get your quackers ready, folks, because it's a big deck episode, with the set Legends clocking in at a hefty 310 cards. That's a real shirt basket full of cards. It's even bigger when you take into account that the set had no basic lands, which is pretty odd for what would otherwise seem to be a standalone set. Legends is the 3rd ever expansion set, which makes it a real fresh-faced babe compared to Arabian Nights, which we discussed before. Unlike that nocturnally Arabian set, which took place on the thinly veiled plain of Arabia, or most early sets which took place on the big home plane of Dominaria, Legends apparently took place not in one location, but just kind of all over the place, which I guess once again opens up the possibility that Whirling Dervish is in fact set on Arabia, as I originally suspected. And since I'm the one making this video, let's just go ahead and say that that's true. While we're at it, let's go ahead and give me a giant golden trophy for being so smart. Thank you. Thank you all for this trophy. Many cardboard conjurers know the origin story of the set Legends' weirdly unfocused development, wherein the creators decided they wanted the creatures to feel more epic, so they used characters from their D&D campaign as inspiration. This is where the eponymous Legends come from, and their goal of creating an array of cards that feel storied and completely unrelated certainly came to fruition. The expansion code for Legends is LEG, or leg, which made me hopeful that there might be another set with the code ARM, or arm, and then perhaps another one with the code HED, or head, so that I could use these sets to construct a little person. Unfortunately, the closest thing I could find to another anatomical set code is RNA from Ravnica Allegiance. The set symbol for Legends is the top of a Doric column. Doric columns certainly aren't the worst, but overall, they're pretty medium. Corinthian columns are clearly top tier. If you want to see my full breakdown of classic column styles, go watch my video, Top 10 Classic Column Styles, over on my secondary channel, and Classic Column Styles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Whirling Dervish is card number 211 in Legends, following Untamed Wilds, which has very pretty artwork, and preceding Willow Satyr, which is the first satyr ever printed, and given its legend stealing ability, I'm kind of surprised I haven't seen it played more in the Legends-centric format EDH. But then I realized that it's on the reserve list, and therefore it costs $1 trillion. This section of my videos where I briefly discuss the cards adjacent to the card I have selected for the episode is easily the most superfluous portion, since these cards don't really have any relation to Whirling Dervish beyond a minor clerical correlation. Looking at this super high resolution image of a Legends uncommon print sheet being displayed on a museum grade dragon blanket and secured by some specialized curator quality statuettes, we can see that the print numbers don't even match how the cards are actually printed. Also, when I say that the card numbering is the most superfluous portion of these videos, I am well aware that I already dedicated a solid 30 seconds to talking about Mrs. Doubtfire, and that in no way detracts from the statement, because that reference was important to the overarching theme of this presentation. The version of Whirling Dervish in Legends doesn't even have its collector number printed on it, although later versions do. One thing that the Legends version of Whirling Dervish does have, though, is quite the price tag. While not reaching the ludicrous levels of its numeric neighbor Willow Satyr, an original version of Whirling Dervish can still fetch around 15 Biden bucks. If you're watching this video in the future and Joseph Robinette Biden is no longer the president of the United States, then that reference might not land as well, and for that I sincerely apologize. If you're watching this video in the far, far future and you aren't familiar with the concept of money, then please, for the love of God, come back in time and save me from this anarcho-capitalist nightmare. Although make sure that you bring a time machine large enough for all of my magic cards. At $15-ish, the original Legends printing of Whirling Dervish is the most expensive rectangle of any rectangle yet to be featured on this rectangle examination channel. Not bad for an uncommon. All of the other versions of Whirling Dervish fall into the standard and magic card price range, being easily purchased with a handful of dirty coins, hastily snatched out of your automobile's center console. Looking at the reprint array, as we did last time, our looking at things eyeballs will quickly catch upon some items of visual idiosyncrasy. To begin with, this Dervish Whomst Whirls is a new record for most printed versions, beating out Giant Tortoise's 9 versions with an impressive 16 different iterations. If you've seen a fair share of magic cards before, some of these versions might immediately jump out at you as being odd, but instead of skipping to these oddities, let's just quickly progress through the full range and get there when we get there. Following the original printing, we have a white-bordered version from 4th edition, because in 4th edition, they added some non-alpha cards to the core set to spice things up. We talked about this in the last video, so we don't really have to talk about it as much now. Like a snowball rolling downhill, our collective worthless Magic the Gathering knowledge increases with each installment, creating expository shortcuts that we can utilize to save time, which I can then fill with more inane banter. Up next, we have the 4th edition foreign black bordered cards. Oh hey, we also talked about those in the last video. These are black bordered because they had never been printed in these foreign languages before, and so therefore, when a Spaniard bought a, oh my lord, Hostigadores de Riviches. Hostigadores de Riviches. Or a person from Portugal opened a Mevlevi, or a person in Japan traded their friend for a Hayate no Deruvu Ishu. That was their alpha equivalent printing. For the last video, I spent a disgusting amount of time trying to find images of all the foreign black bordered versions, and this time around, I'm planning on being much more selective with my time, and just accepting the fact that I won't be able to find the correct name translations or card scans for the majority of these somewhat obscure international releases. If after writing these words and recording the audio for this episode, I renege on this newfound easygoing attitude and end up obsessively searching for these esoteric card images anyway, perhaps you'll see them presented here on your bright glowing device screen. If instead I simply waste a bunch of my time and end up feeling utterly frustrated and defeated, instead I'll put up a video of a cute rabbit or something. Up next, we find ourselves in the Renaissance. And no, I don't mean the period of European history marking the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity and covering the 15th and 16th centuries. I'm talking about the French and German language releases, which contained an assortment of cards from Alpha, Arabian Nights, Legends, and the Dark. Contained in these Chronicles-like re-release products was the French version of Whirling Dervish, Derviche Tournoi, and the German version, Whirling Dervish. Why do I even try and pronounce things? And the German version, Whirling Dervish, respectively. Up next, we get to gaze upon the very first glorious gold-bordered card this channel has ever featured. Gold borders are one of the only 4 border colors ever released to the public, with the others being standard formal black, the white borders, which were briefly used to denote reprints, and silver borders, which adorn the wacky har-har joke cards, which this channel only occasionally mentions. Gold borders were used from February of 1996 until August of 2004, and it was really easy to establish this time frame because those dates are actually printed on the back of the cards. These cards were intended to commemorate the top 4 championship decks from any given year, and you would buy them as complete decks, with the player's signature scrawled across the front. Now that I'm thinking about it, I might have actually very briefly shown a gold-bordered copy of Masticore previously, in the episode about GFS, because Masticore, which I did definitely talk about, was printed 5 different times in this product line, being featured in the decks of Hall of Famer Kai Bude, Mark Lapine, Janosk Kuhn, and the legend himself, Johnny Magic, aka John Finkel, who is also known to be a huge fan of Kithkin Zephyr. Gold-bordered cards are not tournament legal, because they don't have a normal Magic card back, and also because they have a gold border on the front. Wizards of the Coast wanted to be really sure that you knew these were not tournament legal cards, but they've gained a bit of a cult following because they have several distinct qualities which enfranchised Magic enjoyers are way into. To begin with, unlike the cheap looking white borders, which make the artwork look washed out, the gold borders lend the cards a very pleasant gilded look, like the pages of a fancy old book. Secondly, these cards have become somewhat obscure and often quite expensive, and exclusivity is always a surefire way to make big-time cardboard conjurers descend into a salivating madness like the sound of Pavlov's bell jar. Finally, using these cards is kind of dumb, like competing in a professional fighting game tournament with a Hello Kitty CRT. I once played against somebody in a competitive Super Smash Bros. Melee tournament who used the novelty chainsaw controller from Resident Evil 4, and I won that match handedly. But after the match was over, it was my opponent who was getting sweaty handshakes and exuberant backslappage. The Dervish shows up in the first set of championship decks, known as the Pro Tour Collector set, which was unique in that it contained 8 decks instead of 4. That's twice as many decks. Our Whirling friend specifically showed up in the sideboard of the deck piloted by Bertrand Lestri, whose name might not echo with the same grandiosity as more recent stars of the game, but who made it all the way to the finals of the first ever World Championship, as well as making it all the way to the finals of the first ever Pro Tour. In some contests, second place is a far cry from the glory of ultimate victory, but Magic the Gathering actually does a pretty good job of acknowledging the accomplishments of anybody who even nears the pinnacle of competitive success. We can celebrate our humble Dervish too, as this performance easily makes it the top dog out of all the cards we reviewed, despite the fact that it's not a top or a dog, although its propensity for Whirling would probably give it at least honorary top status. In addition to placing second in the 1996 Pro Tour with Bertrand Lestri, this little green creature also showed up in 2 decks at the 1995 World Tournament in Seattle, a deck in the 1996 German Nationals, a deck at the 1996 Worlds again in Seattle, a deck in the 1997 Florida Regionals, and in the 1997 Worlds again in Seattle. For some strange and completely incomprehensible reason, Wizards of the Coast really likes to have tournaments in Seattle. If you look at the 1996 gold-bordered Pro Tour Collector Set Whirling Dervish that currently sits in front of your ocular field, you might notice that there is a little sticker on the bottom of the card with the letters SB on it. While not conveniently explained in any of the articles I frantically consulted while researching this video, the SB here stands for sideboard and indicates that while Bertrand was accompanied by 2 copies of this card in his near victory in New York, they weren't in his main deck. All of the other decks which I listed actually had dervishes in their main deck, although many also contained a couple more riding in the sidecar. If we want to expand our search criteria to also include decks that only contain dervishes in their sideboards, we would see the number of high-level appearances jump up to around 20. This is an interesting distinction for a number of reasons. On its tiny little face, Whirling Dervish seems to be a classic sideboard card, but the fact that it ended up in so many main decks hints at something else, like the bending of intergalactic light, giving the inference of a supermassive black hole, invisible to our eyes, but for the effect that it has on visible things within its area of influence. The first line of rule text on Whirling Dervish is simple, giving this rearing horseman protection from the color black. Protection is an ability which Wizards of the Coast has waffled on a bit over the years, as what it represents is a really resonant concept that can be used to help balance out formats and create interesting counterplay options. But the rules of protection are actually a bit complex and can lead some novice spellslingers scratching their heads. The classic acronym for remembering what protection does is DEBT, D-E-B-T, protection from damage, enchantment, blocking, and targeting. So you can't target Whirling Dervish with a demonic torment, or enchant it with a tackle maggot, or block it with an abomination. You can cast a Heckfire though, which simply destroys all non-black creatures. That's gonna cook your Dervish's goose. Being protected from a color doesn't prevent you from dying, and Heckfire doesn't deal damage or target creatures, it just calmly proclaims them to be dead. I've intentionally only used cards from Legends in these examples, because it's easier to source the images for them and helps establish the feeling that we're back in the 90s, getting beat down by dervishes. Any card which bullies a specific color is going to immediately jump out as being a better option for a sideboard than a main deck. If you play against an opponent who has a black deck, you can bring in a couple of whirlers and present them with a threat they can't directly interact with. We previously touched upon this style of counterplay in the most baneful episode of this series, episode number 2. As you might remember from that episode though, Talara's Bane was not used in any Pro Tours. There are no gold-bordered copies of Talara's Bane. This could be because Whirling Dervish has other text on its card that lends it considerable usage even when it's not facing down black decks. But it could also be because in the era of Whirling Dervish, everybody was playing black decks. If we look back at this time period of Dervish popularity, there were quite a few powerful black cards in competitive play. Hypnotic Spectre, also known as Hippie, Hymn to Turok, also simply known as Hymn, Dark Ritual, sometimes shortened down to Ritual, or even just Writ, and also the card Necropotence, or Necropotence, which is well known for being one of the most broken cards in the history of competitive Magic, and which is often simply referred to as Necro. The fact that all of these black cards I listed also have gold-bordered versions is a strong indication suspicion that this might be the foe which necessitated the deployment of so many dervishes. Whenever a card has a nickname, it's also a good clue that it saw an awful lot of play. Speaking of nicknames, the summer of 1996, when these black cards tore a path of destruction through the game, is commonly known as the Black Summer, or simply Necro Summer. The second ability on Whirling Dervish really is pretty good though, and overall the card can be compared favorably to some other highly played 2-mana creatures throughout Magic's history. But unless you forgot, we're actually still in the portion of this video where we give a quick overview of the different printings. I'm pretty sure that at the start of this segment, I implied we would be giving a short rundown of each variation, which now seems a little bit silly, given how much depth I went into about the last printing. But sometimes you just need to float downstream in an inner tube with a mojito, instead of trying to fight against the rushing currents of your torrential mind garbage. The next printing of our Pro Tour runner-up Dervish is something called the Rivals Quick Start set, which I have never heard of in my entire life. But apparently, according to the internet, it's the first box set ever released. This cereal box looking kit came with 4 mini decks, which could be combined into 2 kind of regular decks, as well as having a more extensive rulebook. Like all beginner products, this is the cardboard equivalent of a dealer hook, a George Harrison try some buy some Xmas morning bombshell ready to decimate your other interests and vastly enhance your vocabulary to the point where you start inventing entirely new words like dirtle, flample, and flunge. It's also important to note that the Rivals Quick Start set had some truly stellar magazine advertisement. This kind of PlayStation 1 Crash Bandicoot satirical marketing is a fine wine that has only grown more superb as the gears of history grind onwards, ever onwards, following the unstoppable arrow of time. The next printing is essentially the same product, but for the European and Japanese markets. The boxes look different though, and honestly, much cooler. This Japanese box art is highly aesthetic, and predates other magical anime excursions. The rival decks in all of these starter products were named for fictional wizards, Zack and Kaz, much like other named characters from Magic the Gathering side products, like Ramaz, Tommel, Warzel, or Azmoran and Mardikat Eistenak Oldakar. They are potentially lost to obscurity. Honestly though, these other characters have a pretty decent chance of showing up eventually, and Wizards of the Coast has been giving us a lot of old school fan service. Someday very soon we could feasibly see a card printed for Azmoran and Mardikat Eistenak Oldakar, but I've never heard of anybody mention Zack and Kaz, and their names sound like throwaway characters from an episode of Max Steel. The next Whirling Dervish on our Tour de Dervish is the one from 5th edition. This section has gotten so long, I actually had to scroll back up to even remember if Whirling Dervish had been printed in 4th edition. The 5th edition one looks just like the one in the introductory 2-player sets, with left justified text. The center justified text of the 4th edition version looks kind of nice, and if I was designing a card game, which I did, I would probably opt to use center justification, which I did. We can all agree that left justification or center justification is better than the original Legends version though, which had the first line of rules text left justified, but then the rest of the text center justified, and all of it was just kind of cramped up into the top corner with a bunch of awkward extra space at the bottom. The next version of the Whirly Dervish is the last real mainstream printing in Time Spiral, the first set from Time Spiral block. The purple colored set symbol here indicates that this card is time shifted, which was a special gimmick in the Time Spiral block. These cards are meant to seem anachronistic, as temporal anomalies caused various cards from the history of Magic the Gathering to erroneously appear in the rift-ridden big home plane of Dominaria. These 121 cards were chosen for nostalgia purposes, and the selections have a lot of unique, flavorful, popular, and powerful cards among them. Despite Whirling Dervish's one-time tournament prevalence, it seems a bit of an offbeat choice here. Another stated reason why some cards ended up with a purple hourglass is simple staff preference, with pet cards like Spitting Slug appearing alongside much more notable cards, with the desired end result being sheer novelty. I think there is a good chance that this is why Whirling Dervish ended up in Time Spiral, and I have some complicated but slightly convincing supporting evidence, which I will expertly present to you if I remember to bring it up at the appropriate juncture later in this video. Finally, after what I can only assume was at least 15 minutes of ever so briefly touching upon the various mass market printings of Whirling Dervish, we arrive at the pot of gold at the end of the mono green rainbow. These cards are eye catchers, real optical dazzlers, and if you haven't seen them before, you might be initially convinced that they are something from another card game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon. But no, these are Junior Series participation promos. These 6 cards, released between 2006 and 2008, were a limited run of aggressively ornate alternate art foils. Foil cards in Magic the Gathering date back to Urza's Saga, but they have evolved quite a bit over the years, and occasionally taken wild detours into uncharted and visually questionable territory. The original style of foiling, which has just recently returned along with the old border to prey upon our collective nostalgia in Time Spiral Remastered, added a layer of shiny metallic foiling to the border of the card. Modern foiling covers the entire card, and is specially designed to highlight certain aspects of the card art. In a previous episode, we mentioned the From the Vault line of products, which had its own signature kind of foiling, which was specifically designed to create as much glare rare as possible. More recently, we have also seen etched foils, but all of these styles pale in comparison to the gaudy overstimulation of the Junior Series promos. Available in several regions and languages, this special Whirling Dervish features new art by channel darling Alex Horley Orlandelli, who delighted us with his superb pulp stylings and throwback webpage design in episode number 7. This illustration looks to be another classic piece by this proficient magic artist, but honestly, it's hard to even see the artwork through the crystalline lattice of premium card effects. These cards are worth about as much or less than the other printings of Whirling Dervish, despite being the prestigious Spring 2007 award for any junior who might have taken part in the Junior Series program. I'm pretty confident that these are the most absurd foil cards ever printed though, even surpassing the weird camo foiling that was only used on some test cards from Exodus. It's worth noting that the obnoxious Starburst foiling was also used on some 5th Dawn test prints. Somebody at Wizards of the Coast was really dedicated to trying to get these palm tree firework looking foils out into the world. Luckily for all of us Horley Orlandelli fans, the very final rendition of Whirling Dervish is a Magic Online promo, which uses the same alternate artwork but without a patchwork of metallic spiderwebs obscuring the card. Both of the illustrations are actually really similar though. I prefer the newer one, but you don't have to be trained in art analysis to easily identify that both of these pictures contain a man on a horse popping a wheelie. Neither of them really seem to be whirling though. As far as I understand it, whirling is just a more dignified version of twirling. Little kids twirl around, but whirling is for adults of high esteem. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you what a dervish is though, although I'm pretty sure I have seen them whirl before. According to the internet, which is this show's unofficial tagline, a dervish is a member of the Muslim religious order who expresses their piety through movement. I'm gonna stop right here and say that while I'm not a person of faith, hitting the dance floor seems like a pretty legit way to connect with a higher power. I'd rather spin, whirl, or even twirl to commune with God, rather than read a book or pray. I have knobby knees. I was not built for prayer. So the dervishes are a kind of monastic order, mendicant ascetics, who ignore worldly goods in favor of pious aerobics. Their focus is on the universal values of love and service, deserting the illusions of ego to reach God. That last line I copied verbatim from Wikipedia, because that line is a grand slam home run. I could spend a long time talking about dervishes, because their history is extensive and complicated, with many branching paths and deep symbolic underpinnings which inform and elevate their rituals, which we are describing here simply as whirling. The most well-known dervishes are the Turkish Mevlevi, which is why the Portuguese version of Whirling Dervish is translated simply as Mevlevi. The Mevlevi perform a ritual known as Sama, which like all forms of physical devotion, attempts to put the user into a trance to help them develop a closer bond to the divine. There is an interesting overlap here between recreational dance and this kind of religious ceremony, and I mean that in a way which is supposed to glorify the impact that recreational dance can have, rather than trying to undermine the power of this religious tradition. While not intended to be performance art, whirling dervishes have become a popular tourist attraction, and in general, people who don't even understand why the dervishes are whirling still appreciate the practice, as accentuated by their signature garb. The most recognizable dervish outfit consists of a long woolen shirt cloak known as a hurka, a skirt called a tenure, which billows outwards, and a tall camel hair hat called a sikh. The dark cloak is cast off at the beginning of the ceremony to represent the rejection of the ego or physical world, and the dervishes spin expertly in a calm, practiced manner meant to be meditative. I've personally spun around before, which I think makes me uniquely equipped to discuss this ancient act, and based upon those numerous personal experiences, I can see how this spinning would help you achieve an altered state. Perhaps because I enjoy endangering small children, or perhaps because small children enjoy being endangered. I have known many young children who are enthused to have me spin them around in the air like a human carnival ride. In addition to making me realize I'm incredibly out of shape, after performing this death-defying feat, I generally do feel at least a little bit more spiritually enlightened, or at least a little lightheaded. I think the way this ritual has gained notoriety as a spectacle is interesting, and like the Shakers, snake handlers, and the power team who break baseball bats and fist punch ice blocks to express their love of Jesus, I would hope that the outside curiosity doesn't impede on their ability to worship in peace. Admittedly, the power team performs on stage in front of hundreds of cheering fans, so they are probably pretty on board with the entertainment aspect of their devotion. But somewhere out there, I'm sure somebody is headbutting a flaming stack of cinder blocks alone in their house as an act of quiet constancy. I've probably seen whirling dervishes in at least a few contexts, but the only one which I can specifically recall is the wedding scene in the 2006 film The Fall. This film is filled to the brim with visual spectacles and incorporates a lot of diverse cultural hallmarks, like the geometric Indian stepwell Chand Bowery, which was also featured in the film The Dark Knight Rises. If you haven't seen the film The Fall, you really should. If you haven't seen the film The Dark Knight Rises, I guess you could also watch that. It has Batman in it. As already explained, the dervishes are indeed monks, so although I was originally a bit unsure about the updated creature typing, Wizards of the Coast have done their research and accurately labeled these horsemen as being holy men. Dervishes, like most monks, aren't super focused on committing coordinated acts of violence though. Shaolin Shaolin monks are famously associated with martial arts. The tonsure-headed monks of Christian monastic orders, the more colorfully robed monks of Hinduism, and all varieties of Islamic monks, including our revolutionary type, aren't generally preparing for war. The fact that the card Whirling Dervish is called Whirling Dervish is probably due to the phrase being used rather indiscriminately by Western historians to describe all of the Muslims who fought in the modest war in Sudan. While these warriors may have adhered to the same belief system as the famous dervishes, it's a bit odd to just lump them all together, and is likely the result of ignorance and laziness, if not intentional misuse, to deride their enemies. So while there were indeed warriors who colonialists called dervishes, the reality is that these individuals weren't actually monks, but trained soldiers. After learning all of this slightly nuanced historical context, I'm inclined to think that monk actually isn't the correct creature type for Whirling Dervish. I think soldier or warrior would be more appropriate, and I am not going to say which one, because that distinction is even more complicated than unraveling a biased recounting of long-fought battles. For better or worse, this change happened with the release of Time Spiral, in which our galloping fighter left its hyper-specific dervish creature type in the rearview mirror, and joined the many other monks from Magic the Gathering's history. I originally thought it was a bit odd to see a monk in green, as I associate that designation with the colors white, blue, and red. But after some very careful research, involving me quickly skimming over the monk cards on Scryfall, and approximating their quantities, I guess the reality is that monks are mostly concentrated in white, and show up in green, blue, and red in similar numbers. There is also a single black monk, which is this really wild flipping ogre from Kamigawa. This is a pretty superficial tribe overall though, with no cards actually caring about the creature type. Whirling Dervish is also a human though, and they have quite a few tribal upsides, and human decks see play in several formats, including Legacy and Modern. Fun fact, if you Google modern humans, instead of getting a bunch of Magic the Gathering deck lists, you will get a bunch of scientifically reconstructed depictions of cavemen, which will send you on a one-way trip to the uncanny valley. I appreciate that scientists are trying to reconnect us with ancient hominids from whom we descended, but also their weird faces totally scared the beans out of me. Whirling Dervish doesn't see play in any human decks though, and as of right now, it doesn't really see play anywhere, which is perhaps actually a good representation of how dervishes actually are in the real world. Looking at the artwork for the original Whirling Dervish, we do see a sword, which reinforces my suggestion that this would be better as a soldier than a monk. But the face also has a pretty astounding look of dismay, perhaps akin to what you would see upon the face of a reserved religious figure who was mistakenly drafted into armed conflict. This painting is done by Susan Van Camp, who is not an artist I'm familiar with. In scanning over her 43 Magic card illustrations, I think it's safe to say that her style is more indicative of early Magic than modern card art. If you don't recognize her name, you'll definitely at least recognize some of her more well-known pieces. We already mentioned Hymn to Turok earlier, and while that card famously had several different artworks, I'm pleased to inform you that yes, she is the artist behind the notorious Three Wolf Moon version. This 80s glamour photo floating sky face motif is actually a real hallmark of her illustrations, and we see it popping up a lot. This visual device is very dated and kind of cheesy, and to be totally honest, I absolutely love it. Taste is a complicated thing, and many people will look down on you if you like something for the wrong reasons. But I'll let you in on a little secret here, that if you like something, then it is good, no matter why you like it. We can't all be grimdark like the film The Dark Knight Rises, starring Batman. Sometimes you're a dancing elvish bard flanked by a giant close-up of your gleefully smirking face, and that's just the way it's gonna be. I will say that other than this standout stylistic choice, I would characterize Susan Van Camp's work as having a real range of proficiency. Some of her pieces do have some silly faces and flat elements, but some of her other work is dynamic and beautifully executed. I think that when examining early Magic art, it's important to remember that some of the contributors weren't aware that these pieces would become immortalized and widely viewed, and that as a professional artist, you often have to put in a different level of effort depending on what the project calls for and the commission cost. Among her more impressive pieces are Desert Twister, Magnetic Mountain, and these Portal Swamps, which I'm quite fond of. I run these exact same swamps in my terrible EDH decks. Susan worked in comics and frequently attended comic book conventions, which is where she was first conscripted by Wizards of the Coast in 1993.
MTG Stores, reinventing the art of collecting.
I first found out about Magic, I stumbled on it. I mean, literally stumbled on it because it was 1993 and you could not walk the floors of Gen Con for people playing the game. I walked around, I saw people playing this new games and they literally didn't have enough tables for all the people who wanted to play, so people were playing on the floor. Not long after that, I was doing the art show and Jesper came up to me. He had a deadline in 2 weeks and he didn't have enough art. So he was desperately scouting the art show, finding people who could do the quality of artwork that he wanted, in 2 weeks. He looked at my stuff, he pulled his hair, and he said, can you do 5 cards in 2 weeks? And he said, well, $50 card and royalties. Okay, I'd worked for independent game companies before, and I know, okay, we're all friends here, and this is, it'll be nice. There aren't going to be any royalties, but $50, yeah, and what the heck, I need to practice. And he looked a little frantic, but like a nice guy. So I did it.
The rushed deadline for the pieces and the rock bottom $50 payment really puts the whole process into perspective and should reframe how you think about old Magic card art in comparison to the new standards of today. I think the art of Whirling Dervish is itself a good representation of Susan's range, with the mountains in the background being really pleasantly rendered, while the central figure is more impressionistic and simplified. The dust clouds kicked up by the horseman in the background, the pose of the central horse, and the wonderfully dismayed look on the rider's face all give this painting a nice sense of action and excitement. I'm sad that Susan didn't illustrate more lands, because the natural elements in her pieces often really stand out. Overall, all of her work does a great job of creating a sense of story, and within the details of these pieces, you can find hints of entire worlds of curious possibilities. If you like a more whimsical style with some classic fantasy imagery and lots of collaged visual elements, then you might want to check out some of Susan's other work. Much of her online presence is defunct or outdated, and it's hard to tell what she's been up to recently, but you can view her old archived website to get a better insight into her world of fairies, dragons, and sexy tiger people. We've spoken at great length before about Alexander Horley Orlandelli and his incredible website in episode number 7, so we'll spend a little bit less time on his rendition of our so-called Dervish. I really enjoy the fact that he decided to go for a true recreation of the original piece, with the stance and basic concept remaining the same, so that we can enjoy a really clean side-by-side comparison here. Taking the time to really appreciate Alex's version makes the notion that it was completely covered by absurd sunburst foiling even more ridiculous, because this piece is beautiful in its simplicity. The heavily shadowed figure is dripping in stoic mystery. The horse actually has some of the same pearlescent luster as its progenitor, but is much more defined, with the gaunt ribcage matching the eerie setting of a decaying fog-caked wood. While Susan Van Camp most likely created her piece with acrylic, we're seeing the telltale signs of the pulp fixture airbrush all over Alex's version. The complementary teal and ochre used to backlight the jagged silhouettes of the rotting tree trunks could believably place this illustration in the haunted forests of Shadowmoor. Like most of Horley Orlandelli's work, this piece can trace a direct lineage back to the likes of Frank Frazetta, and while being seen as derivative can often be interpreted as a terrible insult, I would dare say few modern illustrators would take anything but pride in being compared to a legend like Frank. The pale colors that Alex used on the central figure really helped to set it apart from the surrounding environment, and part of me wonders if this is actually an intentional reference to the Dervish's first ability. While the original card looks to be torn right out of the pages of the 1001 Arabian Nights, the murkier setting of the promo illustration could conceivably be a swamp, and the defiant bravery that the character displays charging through this creepy environment might be bolstered by its protection from all things dark and occult. I appreciate the flavor text that they added to this version. It seems to almost assuage the misnomer that the card possesses by referencing the whirling of blades in place of the whirling ritual of the less warlike dervishes we discussed earlier. This hypothetical knife-infused weather phenomenon does kind of also evoke the card's second ability, where it gains a +1/+1 counter at the end of the turn, whenever it manages to ride in and slice your opponent. This method of representing a creature's growth goes all the way back to Alpha, with cards like Senger Vampire and Fungasaur, which is a fungus dinosaur. Over the years, cards which place counters onto things, and especially cards which place these +1/+1 counters onto creature things, have increased in frequency, and has developed into a popular theme. Cards like Doubling Season, Hardened Scales, Winding Constrictor, and Conclave Mentor make these strategies appealing in a variety of formats. The word counter is a bit troublesome because Magic also has counter spells, which are generally referred to simply as counters. So you can have a deck with lots of counters, or a deck with a counter theme, and those aren't the same thing. This ambiguity is lampooned on the joke card Ambiguity, which interacts with both counters and counters in different, intentionally confusing ways. Most cards that affect counters are green, although this single power and toughness unit of adjusting a creature's stats is versatile enough to appear in all colors. The color black also has a special relationship with these counters though, because black is where we most often see the mirror universe version of +1/+1 counters, the dastardly -1/-1 counters, and like antimatter particles colliding with regular matter, these two inverse indicators cancel each other out when placed on a single target. The color black is also where we find a very familiar looking face in the card Dune Rider Outlaw. Like a twisted parody, this card shows us what Whirling Dervish would look like if it abandoned its devout beliefs and embraced a life of left-facing villainy. While Whirling Dervish has its blade held high in an act of righteous defiance. This human rebel rogue has its blade held high in an act of violent aggression. This card is one of many cards from the set Planar Chaos, which depict an alternate reality version of a well-known card. After many years and 16 versions, Whirling Dervish finally has a nemesis with which to carry out sand-blown equestrian battle. Except since both of these creatures have protection from one another, they are actually incapable of even looking at each other. This pair of opposing cavalry ties Whirling Dervish to another set of cards with which it shares commonalities, and which saw competitive success in the same time frame as well as fulfilling a similar role. The Knights from Alpha are much more iconic than Whirling Dervish. Black Knight and White Knight are both 2-mana 2/2s with first strike and protection from each other. Like many early Magic designs that resonated with players, the mechanical echo of these famous cards influenced the design of similar cards throughout Magic's history. I would argue that Whirling Dervish might be among these descendants, and the later edition of Dune Rider Outlaw certainly helps this case. But there are also more obvious examples, like the mirrored Order of Liet Burr and Order of the Ebon Hand, the Order of the White Shield, and the Knight of Stromgald, which are just the same exact thing as the last two knights we looked at, but with different names. Knight of Grace and Knight of Malice, Silver Knight, which takes the same great formula as White Knight and gives it an anti-red spin, Blood Knight, which is an alternate reality version of Black Knight, but which is also essentially a counterpart to Silver Knight, and White Shield Crusader, which is a new take on both Order of Liet Burr and Order of the White Shield, but with sky-soaring potential. As with all complex categories of Magic cards, one can debate what defines this subset of cards, between mechanical and aesthetic similarities. I think the protection, equestrianism, and mana cost easily pin Red Yarn between all of these creatures though, including the Dervish and Outrider. While most of the knights are 2/2s, I would argue that the ability to grow to extreme sizes excuses our monk and rogue for not starting at a higher numeric value. What adds even more weight to this argument is the fact that in the development of Throne of Eldraine, the most chivalrous set of all time, Wizards of the Coast considered codifying the Dervish ability as Valiance and using it on knights in that set. Ultimately, they ended up going with a different approach, but it's certainly another feather in my tinfoil hat. When the Throne of Eldraine developers discussed this mechanic, they didn't refer back to our Whirling Dervish though. In their design documents, this battle-hardened escalation of stats was referred to as the Slith mechanic. What exactly is a Slith? I'm very glad you asked, because I love Sliths. Also, I have no idea what they are. Throne of Eldraine was not the only time the Cyclone of Blades combat ability resurfaced in the years since Legends. On the chromed-out science fantasy plane of Mirrodin, there exists a race of being known as the Slith. Like all beings on this ball-bearing of a world, these creatures do not originate on Mirrodin, but were abducted from some far-flung corner of the multiverse by a crazy robot wizard to populate the presumably very dull and definitely very sharp plane. Wherever the Slith came from has got to be pretty creepy, because these primitive skull-faced little humanoid beings look like somebody pulled the latex skin off of one of those frightening cavemen we stumbled onto earlier. I legitimately don't know why Wizards of the Coast felt that it was necessary to even introduce these weird little fiends, but I guess if you want to see a rainbow, sometimes you've got to have rain. In this analogy, the Slith are rain, and Noggles are the rainbow. In case you haven't noticed, I love Noggles. In an article titled Bacon Bits from September 22nd, 2003, the cool uncle of Magic the Gathering, Mark Rosewater, explains that the Slith were born out of little more than his own personal fondness for the Whirling Dervish. They started with one singular retread of the original Dervish, simply changing it to have protection from artifacts, since Mirrodin is so chock full of artifice, before eventually swapping it over to Trample. They wanted this card to be part of a full cycle, so they came up with different abilities for the other colors, and now we have a full spectrum of hideous little dervishes. We also see a sliver showing up in Modern Horizons that has the Dervish mechanic, or perhaps more accurately, the Slith mechanic, because it bears a striking resemblance to the Hunched Fiend from the card Slith Predator. Therefore, Tempered Sliver is a reference to a card, which is a reference to Whirling Dervish, and which I think is likely a reference to the Knights from Alpha. Despite all of this interconnectedness though, there is actually another point of origin for all of these cards, which doesn't just relate to the first ever Magic set, which came out in 1993, but draws inspiration from a game which was invented a couple years earlier in the 15th century. When the set Legends was in development, the designers had a cute idea to create a set of cards that represented the different pieces from the board game chess. In chess, each side has a king, a queen, two bishops, a couple rooks, a pair of knights, and a bevy of little cannon fodder known as pawns. Even though I spent quite a while earlier explaining how Whirling Dervish fits into the convoluted Ancestry.com puzzle launched by Magic's most seminal knighthood, and even though I cast some serious doubt on the logic logic behind Whirling Dervish's latter monk reclassification, you'll notice that at no point in this video did I ever suggest that Whirling Dervish might be changed to a knight, despite its varying levels of mechanical and aesthetic similarity. And that's because Whirling Dervish is definitively not a knight, as it was explicitly created to be a pawn. The set Legends originally had a card representing each of the chess pieces in each of the colors, and although this concept was abandoned, the Dervish card design was retained. This history is very briefly explained in an article from 2002, which points to Jacques Levert as another remnant from this early set of designs. Jacques grants his teammates extra toughness, which is a pretty good representation of the defensive properties that a rook can employ on the checkered squares of a chessboard. The Dervish design also very cleverly mimics the behavior of the pawn, which is a small piece with limited capabilities that transforms into a powerful queen if it reaches the opposite side of the board. While for a pawn this upgrade occurs only once and is quite drastic, even though the Dervish only gets marginally stronger when it travels across the battlefield, the fact that you can repeat this endlessly helps to offset this reduction in immediate reward. The ability Renown is a more accurate representation of a pawn's promotion, but it's very possible that this mechanic itself is a descendant of the Dervish design, rather than a separate attempt at capturing the aspirational behavior of the most humble chess piece. Ultimately, regardless of origin, it's hard to say why Whirling Dervish has returned so many times throughout the history of Magic the Gathering. I would not have pointed to Whirling Dervish as being a card with so much influence and recurrence throughout Magic, but it seems like it just keeps showing up, temporally transplanted in alternate versions of reality, with outstandingly garish foil treatment, distilled down to its basic DNA, and reimagined as an entire race of disquietingly lithe skeleton people, and keyworded as a potential ability for a set's worth of Arthurian knights. I'm sure that Mark Rosewater's conspicuous fondness for the card contributed to its initial inclusion in Time Spiral, and it's surely no coincidence that he then brought back the design for the Slith, and led the team which almost imprinted this chessborn template onto the Knights of Eldraine. But as I've delved into the competitive usage of Whirling Dervish and the persistence of its core elements, I've slowly come to think that its many associations and recreations are not due to one individual's personal preference. Whirling Dervish doesn't keep showing up in Magic because one of its most influential stewards has a nostalgic soft spot for this storied little rectangle, but that very admiration on the part of somebody who has been invested in Magic the Gathering for so long is itself a clear indication that what we're looking at is not a dervish, or a monk, or a knight, or even a pawn, but simply one heck of a brilliant Magic card. Hey everybody, that is the end of episode number 12, season 2, episode number 1. I hope you enjoyed it. Some of you might be wondering why I labeled this video season 2, episode 1. The production schedule for YouTube videos doesn't follow any sort of normal seasonal structure. But even though this video might have seemed just like all of my other stupid videos, in one very important but imperceptible way, it was actually quite different. A couple weeks back, I had a conversation with some friends of mine who stream video games on the website Twitch. They were feeling kind of discouraged and burnt out by the whole process of content creation, and I encouraged them to prioritize having fun in everything they do. Later, I realized that I wasn't really doing this myself. I started this channel for funsies, but I was really only having fun making these videos about 50% of the time. So this video is fundamentally different from the others, because I had fun at least 85% of the time. I have to say that one of the hardest things about making this episode was actually choosing which comments to highlight. As always, Dreadmaw the Gathering came through with some excellent combo suggestions, and 2pun Ego commented that they have a pet turtle named Bowser. The fact that I didn't take the time to say hello to Bowser in the intro is really just kind of mind-boggling to me. So I think the sheer amount of excellent comments and the difficulty that I have choosing between them should hopefully indicate to all of you how big a part of this channel interacting with all of you is. I hope you're all finding ways to have fun despite the ongoing global pandemic and general state of the world. Feel free to let me know in the comments below what kind of super fun stuff you're doing. If you're not doing anything fun at all and are simply trying to endure through unprecedented personal and societal challenges, that's totally fine too. And if that's the case, I hope my terrible YouTube channel can give you some small amount of solace. And I hope you'll join me next time on Magic.
If I had a penny for every time I wasn't cool, I'd have no pennies.